dog raised bobcat kittens and a lion cub. Years later, something shocking happened. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows of the Bitterroot Valley Wildlife Sanctuary with a fury that seemed personal. Henry Caldwell pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped into the maelstrom, his flashlight cutting through sheets of snow that fell so thick they seemed to erase the world beyond its beam. At 73, he'd weathered countless Montana storms, but this February blizzard carried a menace that made his bones ache with more than just cold. The power had failed 20 minutes ago, plunging the sanctuary into darkness just as the storm reached its peak. Henry's first thought wasn't for his own comfort in the small caretaker's cabin, but for the dozens of animals under his care: injured hawks, recovering deer, an elderly bear named Bruno, who'd never learned to hibernate properly, all depending on the heated shelters that now stood cold and vulnerable. His boots crunched through snow already ankle-deep as he made his way toward the temporary shelter complex, checking each enclosure with the methodical care that had defined his 40-year career as a wildlife rehabilitator. Most of the animals seemed to be weathering the storm well enough, huddled in their insulated dens or finding warmth among their companions. But as Henry approached the last shelter, a converted barn that housed some of the sanctuary's permanent residents, he heard something that made him pause. It wasn't the sound itself that caught his attention, but rather the absence of sound. Rosie, the old golden retriever who'd become the sanctuary's unofficial mascot, always greeted him with at least a tail thump when he made his evening rounds. Tonight, there was only silence. Henry pushed open the barn door, his flashlight beam sweeping across the familiar space. Hay bales stacked against the walls, empty kennels that served as temporary housing, and there, in the far corner where Rosie had made her favorite resting spot, a sight that made him catch his breath. The golden dog lay motionless, but not in the way that would have sent Henry rushing for the phone. Instead, she was curled in a tight protective circle, her body radiating the kind of stillness that spoke of fierce determination rather than distress. As Henry drew closer, his flashlight revealed what had claimed her attention so completely: two tiny bundles of fur pressed against her warm belly, so small they seemed almost mythical in the harsh beam of his light. Bobcat Kittens, eyes still cloudy with newborn blindness, their bodies trembling despite Rosie's warmth. Henry knelt carefully, not wanting to disturb the scene but needing to assess the situation. The kittens couldn't be more than a few days old, their fur still damp and their movements weak with cold. There was no sign of their mother, not in the barn, not in the storm-lashed wilderness beyond. "Where did you come from?" "Little ones," Henry murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. He'd seen enough abandoned wildlife to recognize the signs. The mother bobcat had likely been caught in the early stages of the storm, forced to make an impossible choice between staying with her vulnerable babies and seeking shelter for herself. Or perhaps she hadn't had a choice at all. What struck Henry most profoundly wasn't the presence of the orphaned kittens, but Rosie's response to them. The dog hadn't moved an inch since he'd entered, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity he hadn't seen from her in years. She wasn't just warming these babies, she was claiming them. Few people at the sanctuary knew Rosie's full story. Henry was one of the exceptions, having been there the night she arrived 3 years ago. She'd been a retired service dog. Her working years ended not by age but by tragedy. During what should have been a routine outing with her handler, a distracted driver had struck and killed her entire litter of puppies. The handler had survived with minor injuries, but Rosie had never recovered from the loss. The psychological trauma had been severe enough that her service career ended immediately. She'd been retired to the sanctuary, not because she was aggressive or dangerous, but because she'd simply stopped engaging with the world. For months, she'd moved through her days like a ghost, eating when food was placed before her, accepting affection without returning it, existing in a gray space, somewhere between life and living. Henry had worked with enough grieving animals to recognize the signs of profound depression. He'd given Rosie space, time, and gentle encouragement, but he'd never pushed. Some wounds, he'd learned, could only heal on their own timeline. Now, watching her with these orphaned bobcat kittens, Henry witnessed something he'd begun to think he might never see. Rosie's maternal instinct roaring back to life with a force that seemed to fill the entire barn. Her tail gave the faintest wag when she saw Henry's approving nod. But she didn't budge from her protective position. Henry's first instinct was practical assessment. The kittens needed immediate veterinary attention, warmth, and nutrition that Rosie couldn't provide. He should gather them up, take them to the heated infirmary, begin the complex process of hand-rearing orphaned bobcats. It was what his 40 years of experience dictated. But something in Rosie's eyes gave him pause. She'd positioned herself between Henry and the kittens, not aggressively, but with unmistakable intent. When he reached toward the smaller of the two babies, she placed her paw gently but firmly over his hand. The message was clear. These are mine now. Henry had learned to trust animal instincts, especially from creatures who'd proven their wisdom over years of coexistence. He settled back on his heels, studying the scene more carefully. The kittens, though cold, weren't showing signs of immediate distress. Their breathing was steady, and they'd begun to burrow deeper into Rosie's warm fur. More importantly, they were responding to her presence in ways that suggested they'd already begun to bond with their unlikely foster mother. "All right, girl," Henry said softly. We'll try it your way, but we're going to need some help." The next several hours became a delicate dance between respecting Rosie's claim on the kittens and ensuring their survival. Henry brought in battery-powered heaters, setting up a warming station that would keep the barn comfortable even with the power out. He fetched kitten milk replacer and tiny bottles from the infirmary. But when he tried to feed the babies himself, they showed little interest. It was Rosie who solved the feeding problem in a way that left Henry marveling at the mysterious workings of maternal instinct. Though she hadn't nursed puppies in years and wasn't currently producing milk, her body seemed to respond to the kitten's needs. By morning, as the storm began to abate and power flickered back to life, Henry found evidence that she'd somehow begun lactating again, a phenomenon he'd read about but never witnessed firsthand. Dr. Sarah Jones, the sanctuary's veterinarian, arrived as soon as the roads were passable. She examined the kittens with careful thoroughness, while Rosie watched with anxious attention, never straying more than arm's length from her adopted babies. "They're surprisingly healthy," Dr. Jones reported, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "Slight hypothermia, but nothing that can't be corrected with proper care. The remarkable thing is how quickly they've bonded with Rosie. Their stress indicators are actually lower than I'd expect." "From bottle-fed orphans," Henry nodded. Unsurprised, he'd seen enough unusual partnerships in the animal world to know that sometimes the most unlikely arrangements were also the most successful. What struck him was how the presence of the kittens had transformed Rosie herself. The listless, withdrawn dog of the past 3 years had vanished, replaced by an alert, purposeful creature whose every movement spoke of renewed vitality. As the days passed, Henry found himself drawn into an unlikely partnership. Rosie handled the nurturing, keeping the kittens warm, grooming their fur with meticulous care, even teaching them proper elimination habits with the patience of a saint. Henry took care of the practical needs, supplemental feeding when necessary, medical monitoring, and the countless small tasks that came with raising orphaned wildlife. He also found himself doing something he hadn't expected: falling in love with the little family he was helping to raise. Against his better judgment, he began thinking of the kittens as individuals, rather than simply as rehabilitation cases. The larger of the two, whose coat was already showing hints of the russet tones that would mark him as a magnificent adult bobcat, earned the name Rusty. When Henry caught himself muttering it during a feeding session, the smaller kitten, whose eyes were developing into the most extraordinary amber color Henry had ever seen, became amber almost by default. Rosie seemed to approve of the names. Her tail would wag with particular enthusiasm when Henry used them, and she began responding to Rusty and Amber as readily as she did to her own name. It was as if she understood that names meant permanence, meant belonging, meant family. The three settled into a routine that brought Henry more joy than he'd experienced in years. Each morning, he'd find Rosie and her babies in a different configuration. Sometimes she'd be stretched out with both kittens tucked against her belly, sometimes curled around them protectively, sometimes sitting alert and watchful while they played in the increasingly bold way of growing wildlings. Henry began keeping detailed notes of their development, telling himself it was for scientific purposes, but knowing it was really because he wanted to remember every milestone. The day Rusty's eyes fully opened and focused on Rosie's face with unmistakable recognition. The afternoon, Amber took her first wobbly steps across the barn floor. The evening, both kittens began purring a sound that seemed to transport Rosie to a state of pure contentment. But it was the night Henry found all three of them piled together in a furry heap, Rusty and Amber grooming Rosie's ears while she dozed in blissful surrender, that he realized how completely his own heart had been captured. These weren't just animals under his care anymore. They were family. Spring was beginning to assert itself in the Bitterroot Valley when Dr. Jones brought news that would change everything. The sanctuary had been selected to receive a lion cub, confiscated from an illegal wildlife trafficking operation. The cub, barely 2 weeks old and in desperate condition, would arrive within days. She's been without proper nutrition or care for nearly a week. Dr. Jones explained during the emergency staff meeting, the trafficking ring was intercepted at the Canadian border, and by the time the authorities sorted through the legal complications, this little one was barely clinging to life. Were her last hope. Henry felt his stomach tighten with familiar dread. He'd seen too many animals arrive at the sanctuary. In similar condition, some survived. Others didn't, but all of them demanded everything their caregivers had to give at his age. With Rosie and her bobcat babies already claiming so much of his emotional investment, he wasn't sure he had enough left for another heartbreak. The lion cub arrived on a gray April morning, transported in a specialized veterinary unit that looked more like a mobile intensive care ward than a simple animal carrier. Henry's first glimpse of her confirmed his worst fears. She was barely larger than a house cat, her breathing shallow and labored, her golden coat dull with dehydration and neglect. Dr. Jones worked with quiet efficiency, establishing IV lines, checking vital signs, administering medications. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. The cub was young enough that proper care might still save her, but success would depend on finding a way to provide the round-the-clock nurturing that only a mother could give. We'll need to set up bottle feeding every 2 hours, Dr. Jones said, not meeting Henry's eyes. They both knew that hand-rearing such a young cub was possible but extremely difficult, without the constant warmth, grooming, and social interaction that came from maternal care. Even cubs that survived physically often developed behavioral problems that made them unsuitable for eventual release or placement in proper facilities. Henry was about to volunteer for the exhausting schedule of bottle feeding when he noticed something that made him pause. Rosie had followed him to the infirmary, as she often did during his daily rounds, but instead of lying down in her usual spot by the door, she'd approached the cub's warming box with obvious interest. The golden retriever stood perfectly still, her nose working to process the unfamiliar scent. Henry watched as her expression shifted from curiosity to something that looked remarkably like recognition. When Dr. Jones carefully lifted the cub for examination, Rosie moved closer, her tail giving the tentative wag that Henry had learned to interpret as her asking for permission. "What do you think, girl?" Henry asked softly. "Room for one more." Dr. Jones looked skeptical. "Henry, I know Rosie's done an amazing job with the Bobcat Kittens, but a lion cub is different. She's bigger. She'll grow much faster. And her needs." She stopped mid-sentence as Rosie approached the examination table and began to gently lick the cub's matted fur. The tiny lion, who had been mewing weakly throughout the examination, suddenly went quiet, Her breathing seemed to ease, and for the first time since her arrival, she showed signs of awareness of her surroundings. "I'll be damned," Dr. Jones murmured. Henry felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation he'd learned to associate with witnessing something that transcended ordinary understanding. Rosie wasn't just showing interest in another orphaned animal. She was extending her definition of motherhood to include this strange new baby who smelled like nothing she'd ever encountered, but whose need was universal and unmistakable. The introduction was handled with careful supervision. Henry brought Rusty and Amber to the infirmary in a carrier, wanting to gauge their reaction before making any permanent arrangements. The Bobcat Kittens, now 12 weeks old, and increasingly confident, showed typical feline curiosity about the newcomer. They approached cautiously, sniffed thoroughly, and seemed to accept that if Rosie approved of this new addition, they would too. It was Rosie who made the final decision when Dr. Jones placed the lion cub temporarily, named Maya, after the veterinary technician who'd stayed with her during transport in a warming box near Rosie's favorite resting spot. The dog immediately positioned herself as close as possible. She began the same grooming routine she'd established with Rusty and Amber, her tongue working patiently to clean Maya's fur and stimulate her circulation. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Maya began responding to Rosie's care within hours, showing an alertness and vitality that had been absent during her first traumatic weeks of life. More remarkably, when it came time for feeding, she showed no interest in the bottle, but instead nuzzled against Rosie's belly with the instinctive determination of a creature who knew exactly where she belonged. Dr. Jones documented what happened next with the careful precision of someone who understood she was witnessing something extraordinary. Rosie, already producing milk for her bobcat babies, seemed to adjust her output to accommodate a third nursing infant. Maya latched on and began feeding with an urgency that spoke of desperate hunger, finally being satisfied. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Jones admitted as she watched the feeding session. "Theoretically, it should be possible for a dog to nurse a lion cub. The nutritional requirements are similar enough in the early weeks. But the psychological acceptance, the behavioral adaptation, it's unprecedented." Henry nodded, but his attention was focused on Rosie's expression. The dog's eyes were closed. Her entire body relaxed in a way that spoke of deep satisfaction. She wasn't just feeding Maya, she was claiming her, accepting her into the family unit she'd constructed around her own fierce need to nurture. The expanded family unit required some logistical adjustments. Henry converted one of the larger enclosures into a nursery that could accommodate 3 rapidly growing babies with very different developmental needs. Rusty and Amber were beginning to show their wild heritage, becoming increasingly adventurous and athletic as they developed the climbing and hunting skills that would serve them in adulthood. Maya, despite being the youngest, grew faster than her adopted siblings and showed signs of the regal confidence that would define her as a mature lioness. But for all their differences, the 3 babies shared an unshakable bond with their canine mother. Each morning, Henry would find them arranged around Rosie in various configurations, sometimes all piled together in a furry heap, sometimes spread out in a formation that allowed each to maintain contact with her, while still having room to stretch and play. Henry began keeping what he privately called his record book, detailed observations of the family's daily life that he told himself were for research purposes, but knew were really a way of preserving memories, too precious to trust to fallible human recollection. He documented the day Maya first stood on unsteady legs and nuzzled Rosie's chin in thanks. He recorded Amber's first successful climb to the top of the wooden structure Henry had built in their enclosure. He noted the morning Rusty began attempting to groom Rosie's ears, his tiny tongue working with the same methodical care she'd shown him. But it was the less dramatic moments that moved Henry most deeply, the way Maya would curl her increasingly large body around Rosie's smaller frame, as if trying to keep her mother warm in return for all the warmth she'd received. The sight of Amber and Rusty flanking Rosie during afternoon naps, their wild instincts already developing, but their loyalty to their adoptive mother, absolute, the sound of all four of them breathing in synchronized rhythm during the deep sleeps of perfect contentment. As spring turned to summer, the sanctuary staff began preparing for the eventual separations that were an inevitable part of wildlife rehabilitation. Rusty and Amber, now 6 months old, and showing all the signs of healthy bobcat development, would need to be relocated to appropriate release sites before their natural independence instincts made them unsuitable for human-managed care. Maya, growing with the explosive energy of a young lion, would eventually be transferred to a specialized big cat facility where she could learn the complex social skills she'd need for adult life. Henry understood the necessity of these transitions, had supervised hundreds of similar separations during his career. But that didn't make the approaching reality any easier to bear. Rosie had thrown herself into motherhood with such complete dedication that Henry worried about how she'd cope with the loss of her adopted children. More selfishly, he worried about how he'd cope with the dissolution of the unlikely family that had brought him more happiness than he'd experienced since his wife's death 5 years earlier. The first separation came in early August. Rusty and Amber were scheduled for release in the northern wilderness areas, where bobcat populations were stable and prey was abundant. The night before their departure, Henry sat with the family in their enclosure, watching as Rosie groomed both bobcat kittens with particular thoroughness, as if she understood that this might be her last opportunity to care for them in this way. Maya seemed to sense the change as well. She positioned herself close to her siblings, her large paw resting protectively across Amber's smaller form. The three babies had never known a world without each other, and their distress at the approaching separation was palpable. Henry found himself speaking to them as if they were human children who could understand and be comforted by explanations. "You've learned everything she can teach you," he told Rusty and Amber. "Now you need to go out and be the magnificent wildcats you were born to be. But that doesn't mean you stop being her children. That part never changes." The actual release was handled by the sanctuary's wildlife specialists, but Henry and Rosie were permitted to accompany the transport to the release site. As the carriers were opened and Rusty and Amber took their first tentative steps into true wilderness, Rosie stood perfectly still. Her attention focused completely on their retreating forms until they disappeared into the forest. Maya's transition came 2 weeks later. The big cat facility was a 3-hour drive from the sanctuary, and Henry had arranged to visit regularly to monitor her adjustment. Unlike the bobcat's release into the wild, Maya's placement was intended to be permanent. She would live out her life in a carefully managed environment, designed to meet all of her physical and psychological needs, while providing educational opportunities for the public. Saying goodbye to Maya was perhaps the hardest thing Henry had ever done in his professional life. The young lioness, now nearly 40 pounds, and beginning to show hints of the magnificent predator she would become, seemed to understand that this parting was different from the temporary separations that had occasionally occurred during her veterinary care. She approached Rosie slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, in the way that Henry had learned to associate with her most serious moods. For several minutes, the dog and the young lion simply looked at each other, and Henry had the strange sensation that they were having a conversation he couldn't hear. Finally, Maya pressed her forehead against Rosie's shoulder and gave a soft rumble that was neither roar nor purr, but something uniquely her own. Rosie responded by licking Maya's face with the same gentle thoroughness she'd shown on that first night in the infirmary. Then she stepped back and sat down, her posture conveying a dignity that seemed to give Maya permission to leave. The drive back to the sanctuary was the longest of Henry's life. Rosie rode in the passenger seat, staring out the window with an expression of such profound sadness that Henry had to pull over twice to collect himself. By the time they reached home, both of them were emotionally exhausted. Henry expected the following weeks to be difficult, and they were. Rosie moved through her days with some of the same listless quality that had characterized her first months at the sanctuary. She ate when food was presented, accepted affection without enthusiasm, and spent long hours lying in the spot where her children's enclosure had been. But this time, the depression didn't deepen into the complete withdrawal Henry had seen before. There was a difference in the quality of her sadness, grief, rather than despair, loss rather than emptiness. She had loved completely and been loved in return, and that experience had changed. Something fundamental in her relationship with the world. The first sign of recovery came 3 weeks after Maya's departure, when Henry was startled awake by the sound of Rosie barking in the pre-dawn darkness. He found her at the edge of the forest, her tail wagging with an excitement he hadn't seen since the early days of raising her babies. Following her gaze, Henry spotted 2 familiar silhouettes moving through the trees. Rusty and Amber had returned not permanently, but for a visit that spoke of bonds too strong to be severed by geography. They approached cautiously, their wild instincts now more developed, but their recognition of their foster mother, immediate and joyful. The reunion was everything Henry could have hoped for, careful sniffing giving way to enthusiastic play. Rosie's maternal fussing met with patient tolerance from her grown children. The Bobcats stayed for 3 days, sleeping near the sanctuary boundaries and making daily visits to spend time with Rosie. When they finally departed, Henry noticed that Rosie watched them go with sadness but not despair. She seemed to understand that they would return when they could, that the family bonds they'd formed weren't dependent on constant physical presence. Maya's first return visit came 2 months later, when the Big Cat Facilities director called to arrange what he described as an experimental socialization visit. Maya, now nearly full-grown and magnificent, in her adult coat, had been showing signs of restlessness that the facility staff thought might be addressed by allowing her to visit her foster family. The reunion between Maya and Rosie was less exuberant than the Bobcats' return had been, but no less moving. The lioness approached her foster mother with the careful dignity of adult wildness. But when Rosie began the familiar grooming routine, Maya melted into the submissive posture of the cub she had once been. For an afternoon, the years collapsed, and they were simply mother and daughter again. As autumn progressed, Henry found himself settling into a new routine, built around these periodic reunions. He began to understand that Rosie's family hadn't been destroyed by the necessary separations. It had simply evolved into a more complex form. The bonds remained strong, but they were now expressed through chosen encounters, rather than daily proximity. Henry started work on a project he'd been avoiding for months, a comprehensive account of Rosie's story and the unlikely family she'd created. What began as a series of journal entries gradually developed into something more ambitious, a book that would document not just the practical details of cross-species fostering, but the emotional journey of healing that had transformed both Rosie and the orphaned babies she'd claimed as her own. He called it Father of the Other Kind, a reference to his own role in the extended family, but also to the broader theme of finding purpose through caring for those who were different, but no less deserving of love. The writing process was both cathartic and challenging, requiring him to examine his own emotional journey alongside Rosie's. The book found its audience among wildlife rehabilitators and animal lovers, but it also resonated with readers who saw in Rosie's story a broader message about resilience, healing, and the unexpected forms that family could take. Henry began receiving letters from people who had found hope in the account of a grieving dog, who had discovered that her capacity for love was larger than her capacity for loss. Rosie herself seemed to approve of the attention her story generated. She appeared at several book events, displaying the calm dignity that had always characterized her interactions with strangers. While clearly enjoying the admiration she received, more importantly, she seemed to have found a new sense of purpose in her role as ambassador for the sanctuary and for the broader cause of wildlife conservation. The years that followed brought their share of changes and challenges. Henry's arthritis made some aspects of animal care more difficult, and he gradually transitioned from direct caregiving to a more supervisory role. Rosie, now approaching her 13th birthday, developed the slower movements and grayer muzzle that marked her advancing age, but their bond remained strong. and their shared memories of the family they'd raised together provided a foundation of contentment that sustained them both through the inevitable difficulties of aging. The periodic visits from Rusty, Amber, and Maya continued, though less frequently, as the distances involved became more challenging for all concerned. It was during one of these visits, in the early spring of Rosie's 15th year, that Henry began to notice subtle changes in her behavior that suggested her time was drawing to a close. She moved more slowly, slept more deeply, and seemed to spend increasing amounts of time gazing toward the forest, where her children lived their wild lives. Dr. Jones's examination confirmed what Henry had already suspected. Rosie was in the final stages of the kidney disease that claimed many dogs of her age. There was no suffering, no dramatic decline, just a gentle slowing that seemed to mirror the natural rhythm of a life well lived. Henry made the decision to let her spend her remaining time in the places that had mattered most to her. They established a comfortable resting area beneath the large oak tree where she'd once napped with her adopted babies, and Henry arranged his schedule so that she was never alone for long periods. Rosie seemed to understand and approve of these arrangements. She accepted the extra attention with the gracious dignity that had always characterized her interactions with humans. But her real attention was focused on something beyond immediate human concerns. She spent hours watching the forest, as if waiting for something or someone. The end came on a perfect June morning, with sunlight filtering through the oak leaves and the sound of birds, providing a peaceful soundtrack to the sanctuary's morning routines. Henry found Rosie lying beneath her favorite tree, looking as if she had simply chosen to rest her eyes and had decided not to open them again. Dr. Jones confirmed that her passing had been peaceful, the quiet conclusion to a life that had been marked by both profound sorrow and extraordinary love. Henry spent the day sitting with her body beneath the oak tree, remembering the night he'd first found her with two tiny Bobcat kittens and marveling at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The funeral arrangements were simple but meaningful. Henry buried Rosie beneath the oak tree, marking her grave with a large stone into which he carved her paw print. It was a memorial that spoke to her role as the foundation of the family she'd created and the sanctuary she'd served. What happened next was something that Henry would remember for the rest of his life. As he prepared to leave the graveside that evening, he was startled by the sound of movement in the forest. Emerging from the trees came three familiar figures, Rusty and Amber, now fully mature and magnificent in their wild coats, and Maya, whose adult lioness form commanded respect even at a distance. The three animals approached the gravesite with a solemnity that seemed almost ceremonial. They arranged themselves in a semicircle around the stone marker, and for several minutes, they simply stood in silence, as if paying their respects to the mother who had saved their lives and shaped their understanding of love. Then, as the last light of day faded from the sky, all three lifted their heads and gave voice to their grief. The sound that emerged, a mixture of bobcat cry and lion's roar, was unlike anything Henry had ever heard. It was wild and mournful, but also filled with something that could only be described as gratitude. Henry stood transfixed as the three creatures he'd helped raise expressed their loss in the only way their wild natures allowed. When the calling finally ceased and they melted back into the forest, he understood that he had witnessed something sacred, a final acknowledgement of the bonds that had shaped all their lives. In the months that followed, Henry found himself returning often to the stone beneath the oak tree. Sometimes he brought his harmonica and played the gentle melodies that had once soothed three orphaned babies to sleep. Sometimes he simply sat in silence, remembering the extraordinary family that had taught him that the heart's capacity for love was limited only by the courage to remain open to unexpected possibilities. The sanctuary continued its work, taking in new orphans and facilitating the complex process of rehabilitation and release. Henry remained involved, though in a more limited capacity, sharing the wisdom he'd gained through decades of experience with younger staff members who would carry on the mission. But it was Rosie's story that remained his greatest contribution to the field he'd served for so long. The book continued to find new readers, and Henry received regular correspondence from people who had been inspired by the account of a grieving dog who had discovered that healing could come through the act of healing others. The periodic visits from Rusty, Amber, and Maya continued, though they became less frequent as the years passed, and the demands of their wild lives took precedence. But Henry always knew, when they were near the trail cameras he'd installed around the sanctuary would capture glimpses of familiar forms moving through the forest, and he'd find small signs of their presence near Rosie's grave. On the 5th anniversary of Rosie's death, Henry made a pilgrimage to the oak tree to find something that took his breath away. Pressed into the soft earth around the memorial stone were 3 sets of paw prints, Bobcat, and Lion, arranged as if their owners had come to pay their respects and had left their signatures in the only way they could. Standing there in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by evidence of enduring love that transcended species and time, Henry understood that some families are not limited by conventional boundaries. The bonds that Rosie had forged with her adopted children, and that he had been privileged to witness and nurture, represented something fundamental about the nature of love itself, that it is not constrained by biology or proximity or even mortality, but lives on in the hearts of those who have been touched by its transformative power. As Henry walked back toward the sanctuary buildings, he carried with him the knowledge that his own heart, which he had once thought permanently closed by loss, had been opened by the example of an old dog who had refused to let grief have the final word. Rosie's greatest gift had not been the specific family she'd created, but the demonstration that love, once truly experienced, becomes indestructible, a legacy that continues to heal and inspire long after its original source has passed into memory. The sun was setting over the Bitterroot Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Henry of the eyes of a small kitten who had once learned to trust in the warmth of an unlikely mother's love. Somewhere in the forest, he knew 3 magnificent wild creatures carried on with their lives, forever marked by the experience of belonging to something larger than themselves. And in the sanctuary that had been their first home, the work of rescue and rehabilitation continued, guided by the understanding that healing often comes in forms too complex for human comprehension, but too powerful for human doubt. The heart that never closed had become a legacy that would endure as long as there were creatures in need of rescue, and humans courageous enough to open themselves to the transformative risk of love